One of the most insidious and bizarre parts of dominance culture is the way that we place the onus on the victim to not only respond effectively to abuse, but to detect it and to prevent it. Our culture is saturated with phrases like, leave the first time they abuse you, or leave at the first sign of mistreatment. We see court cases where anyone who's been victimized is held to the standard of a perfect victim, meaning if their actions don't match up logically to the expectations of the jury or even the larger culture, they're considered invalid even if there is evidence of their victimization, even if the perpetrator of their victimization admits to the crime. In order to move through the world as any sort of marginalized identity, you essentially have to become an expert in looking out for any signs of narcissism, potential abuse, or violence that could be coming your way. And if you end up victimized anyway, despite your identity of hypervigilance, you're expected to respond logically and rationally to that violence. If you stay too long, you're discredited. But if you're perceived as paranoid, you're discredited. This is obviously a paradox. But the interesting thing to me is that it also negates the fact that we are all capable of harm and doesn't allow any space for introspection. Like, what would a world look like if we as individuals were responsible for our capacity to harm one another? What would it look like if in relationships we realized that we were treating somebody else poorly, that we were behaving dishonestly, that we were cheating, that we were manipulating, and as soon as we recognized that behavior, we realized it was our responsibility to leave the relationship? What would happen if we recognized our responsibility to protect the integrity of ourselves and other people and to leave when we recognized abusive behaviors in ourselves? Because the reality is, we all have the capacity to harm and behave in ways that are manipulative, unkind, ungenerous, and harmful to others. Hurt is an occupational hazard of relationship, and nobody is going to get through a relationship without experiencing hurt or get through a relationship without hurting another person. Now, I'm not in any way saying that the inevitability of hurt justifies abuse or harm done, particularly harm done over time and through obvious power dynamics like patriarchy, white supremacy, etc., etc. I'm more speaking to the mutuality of responsibility for the relationship and the well-being of both parties. I hear so frequently men frustrated at the vigilance of women, at the standards women are setting to protect themselves in relationships from men and the ways that they can be victimized by men. Men saying, oh, these buzzwords like gaslighting, or oh, I can't even approach women on the street because they are afraid of me. I think this sort of thought is a failure to do the intellectual and emotional labor to recognize that you have a responsibility in terms of the safety of other people, that women wouldn't feel that way, that marginalized people wouldn't feel that way, that victims of violence wouldn't feel that way if they felt like there was another person or another entity that was also looking out for their safety, integrity, and dignity. Sometimes the biggest role we have in relationship is to protect people from us. When we enter a relationship, whether it's between a man and a woman who are getting married, whether it's a queer relationship, a friendship, or even a relationship between coworkers, the two biggest threats to the relationship are the people involved. Which means we have the job, obviously, of running interference on any harm that could come our way and remembering that we have the capacity to harm another person. Our reality on a day-to-day basis is constructed based on what we're aware of, what we decide, what we choose to be aware of. I always think of it like this. When I see a kid playing or doing something dangerous in my presence, and I'm like, man, I hope you don't get hurt because then I'm gonna have to do something, right? When I'm aware of that child potentially putting themselves in harm's way, that means that I may have an obligation to be responsive to that situation. And so I think it's for this that a lot of people limit their awareness of things to avoid having to take on the responsibility of it. And I think we avoid that responsibility because we worry that if we become aware of all the things that we are already aware of, the fact that we belong together, the fact that some people are more endangered than others, the fact that we live in an unjust world that is saturated in violence, that we will have to take responsibility for that, and then who will be responsible for us? This concept of scarcity cannot govern us as community members. We cannot ever receive the level of support, nourishment, care, and safety that we need if we are emotionally withholding, if we are refusing to call into awareness and take responsibility for the collective well-being. Refusing to see the harm that we can cause others or the harm that others experience doesn't disappear it. It perpetuates it, and it allows it to continue and continue and continue, unantagonized and unobstructed. And so I think one of the most liberating and important things to do is reframe our belief systems around responsibility. To take responsibility for ourselves is first to be responsive to ourselves, responsive to our needs, responsive to our desires, and also responsive to the ways that we have the capacity to harm others. In doing so, this allows us to be responsive to the world around us, responsive to people who sit at different rungs of a privilege ladder than us, responsive to other people's needs and emotions without feeling a sense of loss or a sacrifice of self. When we feel empowered in our ability to respond, we no longer feel helpless and we no longer feel scarce. We feel like we are the drivers of the car of our life. We feel autonomous. We feel like we have agency and some control, at the very least, over our own experiences and how we affect and impact others. There is no freedom to be found in individualism. There is no freedom to be found in vigilance. The only freedom to be found is the fact that all of our liberation is bound up in one another's. My safety is predicated on yours. And in doing so, we're able to call things into our awareness, to take responsibility for ourselves and the world around us without being swallowed up by it. We are all victims and victimized. We are all harm doers and harmed. And there is no disruption of harm or violence if we do not call our attention to it, if we do not make sure that it stays centered in our awareness through a place of compassion, self-forgiveness, and community.